Welcome to In the Fire, a podcast for the young families of Chapelgate Presbyterian Church. Marriage and parenting are a wonderful blessing and are extremely rewarding, but they're also really hard and can leave us feeling exhausted, overwhelmed, and defeated. That's exactly why we started this podcast, to help families see how the gospel injects encouragement, comfort, and hope into the daily grind of our lives, and to remind you that you're never alone in the struggle. There is another In the Fire.
Hello and welcome back to In the Fire. My name is Rob Gicking. I'm the host of this podcast, and today we're going to be talking about one of the main calls of a Christian, and that's to spread the gospel. But how do we do that in our daily lives as young families? You know, whether you're married or you're married with kids, you are living in a specific context. You have certain relational responsibilities you have to deal with, and how do we kind of engage our culture in the space and context that we exist in? And to help us answer that question, I'm joined today by Dr. Dan Passerelli. He is president of Metro Baltimore Seminary and pastor of spiritual renewal here at Chapelgate. Dr. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be with you guys.
Yeah, and I'm putting a lot of emphasis on doctor. Would you care to explain to everybody why that is?
Well, we are recording this episode the week after I received my doctoral hood, and
you've been hooded. I mean,
I've been hooded. Yeah.
What is that for the rest of the world that doesn't live in these? I'll use the word academic realm.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically you get a cloth put over your head. It's like it's a part of the gown, part of the getup.
So basically what I'm hearing is you worked really, really hard to get a piece of cloth put on your head.
I basically got a fancy scarf out of the whole thing.
And TJ Maxx wasn't an option for you?
No.
Okay. Well, everybody's different, and but on a serious note, we're super proud of you, Dan. You did a great job, and we're all benefiting from the hard work you've put in. So really, I like to start every guest off with an extremely difficult question so the rest of the episode seems pretty easy. And my difficult question for you is this. I'd like for you to rank the following sports in order of their entertainment value. Water polo, curling, Quidditch, disc golf, and cornhole. And to be clear, I'm not talking Quidditch like in the movie. I'm talking Quidditch like the kids who are in college. They play, like they run around with the broomstick between their legs. They don't fly. They just literally run around. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
I mean, it's not nearly as fun as the movie version.
It's not.
I got to tell you. So when you say rank it according to entertainment value, is that in terms of watching it played or participating?
Yeah, you're an observer here.
I'm an observer. All right. So I would have to go curling.
As the top or bottom?
As the top. Curling at the top.
Wow.
Followed by Quidditch. Mostly, again, because like college kids running around on broomsticks. Pretty funny. Then water polo. And then what was the other one? Before
disc golf and cornhole.
Yeah. Oh, man. Can they both be at the bottom?
They can.
Very boring. Yeah.
Yeah, very boring. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how disc golf is more boring than curling, but it's a subjective question.
Have you ever seen, Rob, somebody go crazy with a broom on the ice? It is very exciting. Is that curling stone going to stop?
I think
Nobody
part
knows.
of me is just biased against it out of the straight fact that in middle school I had to do a report on curling and there's no ice. So I had to pretend to curl on the hallway floor. And I couldn't use a kettle because that doesn't slide in real life on the floor. So it just was a dud. The whole presentation
All right,
was a dud.
I get it.
But now that we've dug into my sketchy past and sadness, let's go ahead and talk today about what it is to live in Howard County. Obviously, we're not ignoring the Baltimore County, Howard County. What's it like to live in Central Maryland in 2022 and be a Christian? And so to start off, where does this mandate, if I could even use that word, for evangelism come from?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good question, actually. You said at the beginning, that an important part of the life of any Christian is sharing the gospel. And I think what you mean by that, what you mean by the gospel is really this good news that Jesus has come to save sinners. And so in one sense, thinking about the mandate or the command it really boils down to we have this incredible good news that God entered the world to rescue sinners, of which all of us fit that category.
Right.
So I think on the one hand, it's just we have good news that needs to be shared. It can't help but be shared.
Right.
On the other side, I mean, I think, if you want to go a little bit more kind of like a sort of theological with that answer, you could look at kind of the twin mandates of the church and of humanity. So in Matthew 28, Jesus, right before he's taken up to heaven, says to his disciples, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all that I have commanded you.
And that's what we mean when we refer to the Great Commission.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. We call that the Great Commission. But it's rooted, it's a commission, it's a sending out of Jesus' disciples that's rooted in this good news that Jesus has all authority, that the authority in heaven and on earth does not belong to the sin that might condemn us. It doesn't belong to the evil circumstances that might trap us. It belongs to Jesus. And so that sending out, that being commissioned, is rooted in his authority. That's the good news.
Right. So it's not even I'm in authority and you are you're under submission to me. So now go. There is an aspect of that, right? Jesus is certainly higher than we are, and we do look to him as Lord. But
sure,
it's actually he's conquered the enemy.
Exactly.
My enemy.
Yeah. So in some ways, that's just the natural outworking of living under the freedom of living under Jesus's authority.
Yeah, the freedom of living under Jesus's authority.
Right. And then the other kind of mandate we might look at. So that's the Great Commission. That's the New Testament commissioning, sending of the church. But we could look further back into the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, where God creates humanity. And he says to humanity, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And humanity, we call that the cultural mandate, that humanity has been given the mandate by God, in some ways the authority to represent, to live as God's representatives on earth, and to bring all things under the authority of God. We use the term vicegerents. There's sort of his under rulers. And so in some ways, when we talk about evangelism or sharing the gospel, what we're really going back to that cultural mandate, which is bringing all things around us, people, institutions, creation itself, under the rule of God, who has brought all things under the rule of Christ.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, especially in America, right? Like, I don't like the word authority any more than anybody else. We're a country based on not liking authority, right?
Right.
Anybody who was in authority at one point was told you're no longer in authority, and so we can see that as I want to bring creation under the authority of God. I want to bring myself under the authority of God. And it can chafe our hearts a little bit until we recognize exactly what you said, which is to be under the authority of Christ means I am free.
Yeah.
And there's a beauty there. And so the contrary is, if I'm not under Christ's authority, if I haven't experienced a saving faith in him, then I am not free. And so really our call to share the gospel is one of truly good news.
Yeah.
There is a way to be free. There is a better way than this. You don't have to live a slave and die a slave. You can live a life as a child of God.
Yeah, exactly. And this might be a topic for a whole different podcast that you might want to do. But that idea of authority, Bob Dylan has a song where he says, you're going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. And the reality is we all have to live under authority. And so the question is not, am I going to live under authority or not? The question is, what kind of authority am I going to live under?
Right.
And in Jesus, what we have is an authority that invites us to live in a way that we were made to live. We were made to live as God's under rulers over creation. And in Jesus, that role is restored. And so, as you said, it's authority that sets us free.
So yeah, I mean, you've laid out a really good biblical understanding of what's going on, but I think what's interesting is we don't want to be free, right? I don't actually believe the great philosopher Bob Dylan, right? I got to serve somebody, and so almost it's our culture seems to answer that with, sure, if I really have to serve somebody, it's gonna be me, right?
Right.
To borrow NSYNC, the great the great prophets of NSYNC, right? It's gonna be me. And so I go, we seem to be living in times where you and I and maybe most of our listeners are gonna go, yeah, it's great news. Like, who wouldn't love to hear this? But most people seem to not want to hear this. Would you agree that like we're getting more and more into a disenfranchised culture and maybe even a hostile culture towards Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Rob. I think there's a couple ways you can look at that. I mean, certainly there is a sense of disenfranchisement, of disillusionment, that the promises of sort of a Christian heritage that our nation may have may not have panned out for everyone. And so there's sort of a hostility to that. Like, well, clearly that didn't solve all injustice. So like, let's just throw it all off and let's try something else. So yeah, I mean, I do think we see some of that. At the same time, I would say people are always people. And so, I mean, we believe in, I mean, again, like the theological term is we believe in the depravity of humanity, that all of us are born with this rebellion against God. And that rebellion is going to take different forms in every generation. So it's going to look different. And sometimes it may be more overt, more obvious, and sometimes it might be less obvious. And maybe, I mean, you could argue that maybe it's becoming a little more obvious these days. Maybe, yeah.
Sure. I think that what you just said, it's kind of jogging my own conviction, because I think when we talk about the depravity of man, I often see it as an external qualifier. So it's like I think about the depravity of man out there, out beyond my house, out beyond my church, out beyond me, as something that distinguishes me from everybody else. But really, I was right there too before Jesus Christ, right? I'm part of the depravity of man. I'm part of the slave. What did Mike say a couple weeks ago in his sermon? The tyranny of self-interest, right? I'm living in that, and it's by the grace of Jesus through faith that I exit that and enter into the new life, right, of Corinthians. And so I think that's helpful. We may come back to that later as we sort of talk about how do we engage this hostile, depraved, culture of ours. Well, certainly not from a place of pride, but let's come back to that. So, statistics are showing that people are walking away from church at really, high rates, that the fastest growing quote unquote religion of the day is actually none.
Right.
We're walking away from Christianity, but we're also walking away from sort of any higher spirituality.
Yeah. I've heard people refer to that category as the nuns and duns.
The nuns and
right.
duns.
They have no religion, and they're done with religion.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just curious. It's one thing to be a nun and dun, but it really starts to feel, for me, and I know some of our young families are even trying to deal with this from a parenting perspective, it'd be one thing if it was none and done, but it almost does feel like it's none and done, and you better be as well, right? I mean, we're in a season right now that seems like our depravity. Maybe it is more, maybe, but it's certainly more in your face. We're proud of the things that are counter to Scripture. We're really critical and questioning and cynical even towards those who hold to a Christian faith. And so as you've thought through that in your role at church, but also with the seminary, like how do you think we are to engage? I mean, there's a couple ways we can, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Rob, one of the things that's interesting, as our listeners don't know this, but before we even started this conversation, we prayed together.
Right.
And now our listeners know that.
Now you know.
Now you know. But as I think about evangelism, I think in some ways it starts with asking, with prayer, with asking God to open my heart to what He's doing in the world around me, in the people around me. So it doesn't start with me assuming I have all the answers. It doesn't start with me even necessarily being confident that I'm going to be able to answer all the questions that people may or may not have. There's one of my favorite Proverbs 18:13 says, to answer before listening, that is folly and shame. And so what I would say is it starts with listening first to God, asking God to make clear who are the people He's bringing into my life that He wants me to invest in, and then listening to the people that are around me. What are the questions they're asking? What are the questions they're not asking?
Yeah, that's great. What are the questions they're asking? I mean, there's almost a sense in which we sort of jump into their it's like I take my brain and I put it in their life and I go, what question would I be asking if I was 35 and had 3 kids and was living in Maryland? It's like, no, because literally it's a Christian worldview, right?
Yeah.
Like I see the world through a completely different lens because of Jesus. And so, yeah, talk to me, like, how do I even begin the process of going, what question is my neighbor, is my coworker asking? Because it's not the question I'm asking.
Yeah, well, I mean, before I answer that question,
Sure.
I'm just, as you were talking, Rob, I'm thinking, those of us that are in a marriage or that have kids, we know that doesn't go well when we assume that the other person is reacting the way we would react. I mean, we probably see that almost every day, that does not go well, right?
Right. So,
why would we think that it would be any different with any other kind of relationship, So yeah. Now you were asking me. Sorry, you asked me about.
Yeah. So I think the question really then becomes, how do I start to? You said listen, and I think that's key. But what do I listen for? How do I start to actually realize that my neighbor is asking a question, my coworker is asking questions, maybe even without asking questions? Because when was the last time someone came to you and said, you know what, Dan, I was curious, do you think there's a heaven and a hell? Right? That's not a question that comes up very often, but if we listen, we actually do hear that the people in our lives are asking questions.
Yeah, and I think there's like a biblical sort of example of that, and then just sort of some practical things. So I can kind of speak to both. I think if you look at Paul's interaction with the folks in Athens when he's there, he spent a good bit of time out in the marketplace just observing, and when he finally was sort of offered a public venue for speaking, he said, look, men of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. He saw all these statues all over the city. And he said, even in this statue of the unknown God, you recognize that there is some ignorance, that there's something missing that you don't know. And so we certainly don't have physical like statues to things that we consider gods or goddesses in our current cultural context. But there are plenty of things that are all around us that point to the reality of where people's hearts are going, the things that they're giving their time, attention, worry, hope in.
Yeah.
And so I think what we begin to do is to ask, what are the deep heart cries that are being expressed that maybe people don't even know they're expressing?
Yeah, so it's like a two-step process, though, don't you think? Like, on one hand, I need to start to see, like Paul, as he walks through Athens, the idols of the city of Athens. And so for us, I think we need to be aware of the idols of our area. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm a little bold here, but I would actually argue the idols of my area are going to be most clearly seen in me. It's not walking around and looking at, quote unquote, the unbelievers and going, what idols are they struggling with? It's sort of like, hey, I mean, I'm a product of this area, right? I've born and raised in Maryland my entire life. I went to school in Maryland. I drink and eat Maryland, right? And so I go, what are the things that I struggle with? And if I was to be really honest, it's success. I want to be really, really successful. And not just for myself, but I do secretly, I want people to acknowledge that I am successful. That, I would say, is one of the idols of our area. Excellence. I want people to see that the things that I do are excellent, and I want to be seen as an excellent person. Money, I throw money in there. I mean, obviously, we're an extremely wealthy area, one of the wealthiest in the country, and we're in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So, yeah, wealth. And so, as you are at home, sort of listening along to this, begin to think through your neighbors, your coworkers. What are the things that they are unconsciously believing will bring them happiness, satisfaction, and contentment?
Yeah.
It's probably the same thing that you are thinking, if I just had more of this, then my life would be good. What do you think about that, Dan?
Yeah, I think that's true, Rob. I think, in addition to those things that you listed, I might throw in there also the idea of education. I think people put a lot of hope in education.
That's very true.
One of my mentors said, if you want to find somebody's idols, just look at what makes them mad. Or again, speaking to you, like when your idol is challenged, your default response is going to be anger, right? Yeah. So just think about whenever somebody tries to tweak education in this area, people get all up in arms, right? And that's not to say there aren't legitimate things to be upset about in that, sure. But I think kind of going below the surface, it exposes, some of those idols. Now, here's the real interesting question: is all of those things that we've mentioned are all, in some ways we see them either up on the surface. If you think of like an iceberg, they're things that kind of like are either up there floating on the surface that we can see, or maybe they're just below the surface, but we can kind of, we can get to them pretty easily. The real question becomes, what's deeper below that? What are some of the deeper things that are driving the people around me that maybe they won't even acknowledge to themselves?
All right, Dan. So we just we took a brief pause, and where we left off, we were talking about how our idols, right? Our idols really almost reveal the questions that we're asking about life. I want to seek. I'm seeking this thing, whether it's success or money or wealth or whatever it might be, because really at the end of the day, I'm kind of asking the question: will my heart be satisfied by this? And what happens if it's not satisfied this? And so that's where I start to hear the questions. But I think before we go any further into like how we listen to our neighbors and things of that nature, let's just kind of talk about the sometimes sad but reasonable reality of our two default responses of living in a world that is not only not interested in what the Bible has to say, but almost comes across a little hostile at times, against it really. And so I go, it seems to me there's two default responses when faced with a threat, right? It's to retreat or to go on the counterattack. And so it's really a fight or flight mechanism in some ways, where I look around at my culture and I don't like what I see. And especially when you think about kids, right? We're talking to young families here, many of which have kids. I go, I want to protect my kids from this. So I'm going to retreat. I'm going to pull out of, the public area of life, and I'm going to really close in so that I protect my child. The other is to go on the counterattack. It's to say, no, I'm going to be out and against all these things that our culture is shoving down my throat. And so could you talk to us a little bit for just a brief minute about what's the cost of that? Like what is the cost of retreat and what is the cost of counterattack? And do you believe that in Jesus we see a better example?
Wow. Okay. So there's lots in there. Great question, Rob. And I like the way you kind of phrase that at the end. I think where I would start actually is kind of where we started at the beginning, is all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus. And so if that's the case, then in some ways, I don't have to be afraid of anything that the culture is saying, because Jesus is Lord over all of it. He turns, God talks about turning even the hand of the kings or the heart of the kings in his hand. And so if Jesus is Lord of everything, I don't have to be afraid of the messages that are coming at me or at my kids. And I don't necessarily, so on the one hand, I don't have to pull away. Certainly there's wisdom there, right? Like we have to exercise wisdom in, just like in my own life. If I am constantly watching a particular show and sort of my life is invested in that, and I start to adopt that sort of mindset or that mentality, that can be unhealthy. I'm reading a book right now that's set in Mars, and I have to remind myself this is fiction. So we see that like in any message, anything that we consume, we have to be wise about how we consume it, but we don't have to be afraid of it. And I think that's the important thing. And at the same time, we look at how Jesus won the victory over sin and death and Satan. It was through his own death, through laying down his life. It was through entering into the world that was broken and walking alongside of broken sinners. He was not afraid to get his hands dirty by touching sinners. He wasn't afraid to confront the powerful rulers. But he always did it in a way that he never needed to win. Because he knew where his authority came from. And so what I would say is we don't have to pull back in fear. We don't have to lash out needing to win an argument or a fight or a political cause or a social issue. We don't have to win any of that. Again, that doesn't mean we don't engage in those, and we could talk about that. That could actually be a whole separate, topic.
Absolutely.
But one of the one way of thinking about that third way, as it were, is offered by Tim Keller, and it's sort of a 3-step process where, when you're confronted with a claim by the culture around you, that is contrary to the gospel, something that's not true, you first, rather than either running away or lashing out and saying, no, that's wrong, you first ask, what is true about this? Like, what is the heart longing behind this? What's this person looking for? And affirm that. So in education, for example, the longing for education is to know more about the world. It's to understand. Well, that's a good thing. God created us for that.
Right.
So we affirm that and say, yes, this is what we were made to know, God and his world. But then, how is it being misused? In other words, how are you never going to find what you're looking for the way you're looking for it?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, it makes me think of like Psalm 19, right? The heavens declare, your works, oh God. And it's like, yes, there is an avenue of like God puts the galaxies and the stars and these things in there because it stirs something in my heart. I had a friend, okay, he's not a believer at all, and he was actually sharing this. He loves hiking. He loves getting out of the city and out somewhere far away where there's mountains. And he just says to me, now he uses the word vibe, right? He says there's a vibe out there that just I can't explain. And I said, yeah, you know what? I think you're right. There's something about being in nature that is transcendent. And he was like, dude, that's exactly how I feel. And I said, why do you think that is? And we had this awesome conversation, but it didn't start with, well, that's stupid,
Right.
That's just ridiculous. Well, you feel that way because that's God's handiwork trying to point you to him. No, I said, yeah, I totally get that. And just to be clear, that's not to brag on myself, but it's because I think there's a sense in which, yeah, there's something really, they're closer than they think a lot of the time.
Exactly. Just like the Athenians were closer than they thought without realizing, and yet they were still far off.
Absolutely.
Because Paul says they were ignorant. The thing that they tried to worship in ignorance, Paul was exposing that to them.
Right.
And so certainly it's not, Keller's approach is to say, yes, this is what you're looking for. No, you're not going to find it this way. So, again, in education, like, you can be the best educated person in the world, and that will not make you happy.
Right.
You can know more than anyone else. You can win Jeopardy for the next, 10 years straight. And that will not bring you satisfaction. It will not make you complete. Why? Because you were made to know not just about the world, but the one who made the world. And so that's why, as important as education is, it will never save us. That's why, as important as, work is, it will never save us. That's why, as important as security is and safety is, ultimately, that will not fulfill us in life.
Dan, that's just, that is such a helpful mindset, paradigm, template, because I think it really does, it actually allows me to draw near in a way that I can listen to those around me. I can hear your question because I don't feel the need to flee from you because of your opinion, and I don't feel the need to dismantle you immediately to show you the foolishness of your ways.
Yeah.
I can actually go, hey, my neighbor has something going on in their life that I can actually resonate with because deep down, or maybe not even so deep down, they too bear the image of God.
Exactly.
Which means there is something in them that is still searching for him. They might not recognize they're searching for him, but they're searching for him.
Exactly. They were created with that same cultural mandate, that same creation mandate that all of us were. And so that is our point of contact with anyone, whatever their story, is we both bear the image of God. We both carry the wounds and the scars of sin. and we're both only going to find wholeness in Jesus. So, then I guess when it comes to actually listening and how to do that, I think in some ways, Rob, this frees you, because I think sometimes we hear evangelism and we either think one of two things, either like, I gotta be out there confronting everybody, I gotta be, in the face of all my coworkers, and I gotta be obnoxious. And some of us, like, we can't do that because, a lot of folks are in jobs where
right,
you can't, you really don't share like a lot of, outside of work stuff.
right.
But that doesn't mean you're not being faithful to Jesus, simply, and to the call to be a disciple maker, by simply listening, by seeing the image of God, and by looking for the ways God is at work in that person and getting on board with what he's doing in their life, rather than trying to bring my agenda. I think sometimes, I know personally, I have felt guilty, like, oh, I'm not doing what I should be doing because I'm not speaking boldly enough. And maybe that's true, but I haven't actually asked God if that's true. I've just assumed that
Right.
I have to be speaking like an obnoxious person, or making myself obnoxious, rather than asking God, help me see what you're doing and help me to speak truth into this person's life, or to be quiet and just to walk alongside if that's what's needed.
Yeah, that's really good. It does help sometimes to hear that, because I think we can carry around a guilt. You think about Romans 10, how will they believe in whom they have not heard?
Right.
How will they hear unless someone tells them, right? And
Right.
I'm going, oh man, when was the last time I just told my neighbor the full-on gospel, starting with creation and then the fall? And it doesn't happen very often, but I go, there's a pastor, actually it's one of the pastors that our church supports here at Chapelgate, and he says, serve them, love them, and if you do those things, they will ask questions. And it's a cart before the horse, or the horse before the cart, because we tend to think of evangelism as, let me go tell them about the gospel. Well, let me instead maybe think about, what can I do to love them?
Yeah.
What can I do to serve them? Not even just for the point of, so I can tell you the gospel later, but because that, if I have abundance in the love of Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
which we do, I can share.
Yeah. And I think the need to begin and end and have in the middle prayer for the people God has put in my life. Because when I'm asking God on their behalf for their good, then I'm going to be a lot more in tune. I guarantee you'll find yourself actually speaking up more than if it was like, okay, I got to go tell them about Jesus now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not advocating silence. I'm not advocating, that we got to just be good people, and that's enough. Be a friendly neighbor. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, ask God what he's doing in the lives of the people we work with, the kids on our child soccer teams, their parents, the people that we see when we go to the store. Is there somebody that you see every week when you go to Dunkin' Donuts? Am I allowed to talk about a specific, any coffee store, whatever coffee store you go to? Sorry, Rob.
This podcast is not sponsored in any way, shape, or form by Dunkin' Donuts. With the budget we're on, it would actually be like the Folgers, more likely.
There you go. There you go. But is there somebody you see every week that maybe God wants you just to start praying for, and start there?
Well, Dan, I think this is as good a time as any to kind of to wrap it up. And just in summary, I think if I could capture your thoughts, I would say this, that really what you shared today is that we are first and foremost to be transformed by the gospel. Before I ever seek to carry the gospel out to others, I need to further understand it myself, because I can't give what I don't have. And so as I start to see myself, as we talked about, as a sinner, right, that's actually something I have in common with every human being. And as I see myself as a sinner who's been saved by grace through faith, not by any merit of my own, that actually gives me a tenderness, a charity, a charitability, if that's a word, towards my neighbor, because I realize the only thing different between me and them is that I know Jesus Christ and I submit to his authority now, not the tyranny of self-interest or the tyranny of wealth or the tyranny of whatever it is, ultimately sin that's over my life. And so the gospel actually gives me the right lens to engage, because when I understand that this is God's work, God is doing a work in the life of my neighbor, and that's the only one who can, because it's who did a work in my heart, then I go, I don't need to flee and I don't need to attack. I need to be present. I need to listen. I need to pray.
Yep.
So, as we do come to a close, I just want to say thank you. I do have one last question for you, which is this. If someone out there is listening right now and they go, hey guys, that's great. I get it, but I also struggle, because sometimes I struggle to explain the gospel. I struggle to explain why I think the Bible is trustworthy. These more like brass tacks, fundamental side of defending and sharing our faith. Talk to me a little bit about what you would recommend them for in terms of the seminary.
Yeah, so Metro Baltimore Seminary has a one-year certificate program where we offer to students kind of a survey of Old and New Testament, a little bit of an introduction into Christian theology, and it's very accessible. You can take classes. It's one night a week. And if you want to just come and learn a little bit more, you don't even have to sign up for the full program. You can come and take, one or two classes, see how it goes. I'm actually teaching a class on evangelism and apologetics starting at the end of August. So if you wanted to just come and audit that class, you're more than welcome to do that. So classes meet at Chapelgate. We also have a site over in East Baltimore at Freedom Church. And I'd love, check out metrobaltimoreseminary.org. And we've got some online information sessions happening throughout the summer. We'd love to, talk with people there, or, contact me individually. I'd happy to do that. So.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I will be putting the link for the website down into the show notes. If you want to learn more about Metro Baltimore Seminary or Chapelgate, both the links will be down there. We'd love for you guys to check that out, because we believe that what this church and what the seminary are doing is really preparing us to go and be the people God has called us to be.
Yep.
So thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate having you, and hope we get to do it again.
Thanks, Rob. I hope so too.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode with Pastor Dan Passerelli. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to him and just wrap our minds around what it means to be missional as a young family. As always, if you want to learn more about Chapelgate, or you want to know how to get involved as a young family yourself, please check out our website. The link is in the show notes, and we look forward to catching up with you again very soon in our next episode of In the Fire. Thanks for listening.